Hello and welcome to episode 312 of the Clean Energy Show. I'm Brian Stockton.
And I'm James Whittingham. This week, Pakistan's shadow grid is made up mostly of solar panels, and it's bigger than the official power grid now. I'd like to think my shadow is bigger than the official me, but that has not been verified.
Researchers in Australia are studying how bats are interacting with wind turbines. The short answer? Bats shouldn't interact with wind turbines. It tends to end badly for them.
The cost of keeping coal plants open is astounding. In fact, I'm astounded.
You look astounded. A widely used app for your phone can be used to tune the engine on your gas or diesel car in a way that can increase pollution. This has to be the worst phone app since that one that simulated drinking a beer. Wait, what am I saying? That app was super cool.
All that, the lightning round, and more on this edition of the Clean Energy Show.
All right, so I have an update this week on dry airplanes.
Because you and your family always come off an airplane with disease, with a virus of some sort.
You know, it's a common thing. You often catch
Did you get COVID once on a plane?
My brother caught COVID on a plane.
Oh, yeah?
But anyway, one of the reasons we discussed last week was the air is very dry on airplanes for some reason. 10%, 20% humidity.
Yep. Dries up your mucus and that doesn't protect you anymore.
So I got to wondering, is there such a thing as a portable humidifier? And the answer is yes, absolutely.
What would it do for you on a plane? Does it hook directly up to your nostrils?
It has a mask that covers your nose and your mouth. So you hold it up to your, like you're breathing oxygen from a hospital or something.
Okay.
And it covers your nose and mouth, and you can breathe in. It's battery powered. You can have a little bit of water in it, so you can breathe that in and humidify your pipes, as it were.
I'd like to see that go through the TSA checkpoints.
Yeah. I mean, it's another thing. I don't know if anybody actually uses them for airplanes, but it was something I was wondering about. The fancy ones are called a mesh nebulizer, which they can be used to dispense medication. Some medications are breathed in.
Okay.
So the mesh nebulizer, you can fill it with saline or whatever, plus the medication that you're supposed to breathe in. And it atomizes it and, steams it or whatever and puts it into your mouth.
So I can't see you doing this because you would look like a fool, or at least a very sick man.
Yeah. Not a good look to be walking around having to constantly breathe out of a
or somebody wakes up and sees you have your oxygen mask on and gets theirs pulled down or something, and the whole plane's doing it, and then you're landing, and it's the whole thing.
Or it's like a Dennis Hopper situation from Blue Velvet, where he was huffing the nitrous oxide, which
there's an easy reference for you people. There's a reference for you older people.
Blue Velvet, great old weird movie. I want to talk about bats versus wind turbines. And I wasn't necessarily wanting to talk more about this topic because we've talked a lot about birds and wind turbines. And I don't want to give the impression that it's bad to switch to wind turbines because some birds do get killed, because the absolute worst thing we can do for all animals on the planet is to keep burning fossil fuels and keep polluting the air and keep wrecking the climate. So there are some issues with clean energy like wind turbines. And
I'd like to point out that if you don't go with turbines, then whatever you're using actually does kill birds. Even nuclear kills birds, apparently.
Oh, yeah. Apparently.
So whatever your alternative you're using is also going to kill birds, but maybe not as many. I don't know.
Yeah, coal plants put things like mercury into the air, and mercury's not good for anybody, including humans or birds or whatever. But in any case, this story was fresh to me because it involved bats. Usually these stories are about birds, but this is from Renew Economy, and it's a story from Australia, and they now have better tools, some of which use AI, to essentially map the patterns of bats. And in Australia, specifically, they have a lot of microbats. Do you know what microbats are, James?
Microbats are a specific group of small bats. For a long time, scientists divided all bats into two main groups based on their size: megabats, large bats, and microbats, small bats. They also separated them because microbats use echolocation, a way of sensing things by bouncing sound waves off objects. However, Brian, recent DNA and molecular testing show that this old way of grouping microbats isn't perfectly accurate because microbats don't share all the exact same exclusive family tree of the other bats.
Right. So you read the script and you did some research.
I did some research. Yeah. What is it? Am I getting penalized for reading the script now?
So anyway, not sure I even heard of microbats, but yeah, there's two categories of bats, and these are very, very tiny often.
It could be a good superhero that hasn't been thought of yet.
Exactly. Microbat, macrobat, megabat, all these are great names.
The whole bat family.
Yeah. So anyway, scientists in Australia, they set up these towers that did not have the turbine blades on them, but they're similar height to a wind turbine. And then they set up infrared cameras and all these other sensors so they could track the patterns of the bats. And the first thing was they found that the bats were very curious about these masts, like they were literally flying around them to figure out what they are. And so, that's a big problem if they do the same for wind turbines, which seems highly likely. For whatever reason, you put up a big, tall stick in the ground, the bats get interested in it for some reason. But the idea is that you do enough research to figure out the patterns of bats and birds as well. This applies to birds. This specifically was more about bats, but once you figure out what attracts them, when they're attracted, time of day and everything, you can actually just shut down the turbines. Like, this is a thing that is done in some parts of Europe, mandatory curtailment. So once you know the specific patterns of the wildlife in the area, and there are certain times when animal collisions are more likely, you can literally slow down or just shut off the wind turbine blades. So this is mandatory in parts of Europe already. And there's been as much as a 54% reduction in fatalities with birds and bats when you practice this curtailment. So this is the idea, and it's a good thing. According to these studies, you do, of course, lose a bit of power and you lose a bit of money when you have to curtail your wind turbines. But so far, the estimates are 1% to 4% of annual revenue from a wind turbine when you have to follow this curtailment. The idea is you do it smartly and only when, you really kind of need to.
I see. Well, sometimes they study the migratory patterns of endangered birds or birds in the area and build around that.
Yes, and sadly...
But that's more money and more time to put up wind, which is why it's more complicated than, say, solar, for example.
Yeah, and a lot of these microbats are, in fact, endangered species, so it is important to try and protect them.
Well, that's because they're micro, Brian.
Mm-hmm.
Anything small could be endangered easily.
You could just step on one and they're,
Sure. Hopefully they kill mosquitoes, the wind turbines. They should attract mosquitoes and kill them. Put a mosquito attractant on there.
Wouldn't that be great? How can we maximize our turbines to kill mosquitoes? That would be incredible.
Well, if you're killing bats, though, who eat mosquitoes, then that's a problem. Yeah. I was thinking you could put a bat house on the top of the tower, but then that would just attract the bats to the turbine blades. But that's a bit of money, 1 to 4%. That's going to discourage investment, but perhaps the state can make up for that in some cases. I don't know.
Yeah, and eventually once this stuff is overbuilt, which we expect it to be, then losing 1 to 4%, eventually 10, 20 years down the road, shouldn't be too big a deal.
All right, I've got a segment here of hodgepodge stuff, Brian, that I'm going to call fossil fuel talk, because it's good to be talking about fossil fuels.
Great.
There was a story out this week that high oil prices, the conflict in Iran or on Iran, and the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's crude goes through, is mostly blocked, not completely, but mostly blocked. So the supply is under pressure, and that causes oil prices to go up. They are up over $100 a barrel now. And when we had a story on our show just before the Iran conflict that our province, which is a petrol province, Saskatchewan, Canada, and Alberta, which has even more money from petroleum, were having deficits. So they're in their budgets because they rely on oil revenue and they underestimate it. And we said, well, didn't you know electrification's happening and there's going to be pressure on demand? That doesn't always happen because you can control demand if you're OPEC, but that's another story now. So high oil prices have turned a $9.4 billion Alberta deficit into a $6 billion surplus.
Yeah.
So ain't war great that, I'm sure our politicians here who are in charge are just thrilled whenever there's a conflict in the Middle East because they love their oil.
We've had these boom and bust cycles in the past, and we should be getting tired of them and planning for something other than this constant boom and bust.
Of course, now they're saying in Alberta, 30% of the population wants to leave Canada. I say, fine, leave, but you can't take Canada with you. You can't do that. You have to just go away. I'm sure, the administration in the United States should have a policy to welcome Albertans into the United States who want to leave. Go ahead. So the high oil prices have solved their problems, and that's very good for them and for us. But we know that this is actually going to mask the transition that is happening even at a faster pace, let alone at the pace that it was.
Yeah.
And they say that oil prices, regardless of what happens, could be high for a year because of the damaged infrastructure.
Yeah.
So they could be somewhat high, higher than they normally would be. Yeah. Because they were down into the high 50s, which was very bad. And
of course, oil reserves are being drawn down, so it could take a long time to build those reserves back up again, and that could keep the prices high.
So my argument is by the time a year from now where they start to settle down again, is like, there's this big hit, the even bigger hit into the demand because of electrification around the world. And we're talking about 2- and 3-wheelers in developing nations, and which use a lot of gas. And we're talking about electrification in Europe and China and throughout Asia, and even India now is starting to electrify. And when those, that demand gets hit, then the prices go down, and then you control your supply, which is OPEC, but OPEC seems to be falling apart. So we'll see what happens. I've said that high oil prices are good for the transition, and I think that's very true. But also, there's a lot of talk now about what would happen when the prices do fall, and it's not going to be good for the transition. So it's kind of good that they are high. I mean, I don't want war. I'm not, cheering on the war myself, but it does do good things for the transition. And if oil prices suddenly crashed, and if OPEC falls apart, which is possible because UAE, which is was the second largest member in OPEC with the second largest oil reserves, the unused oil, untapped oil reserves that they could let flow if they wanted to. They've left OPEC. So OPEC is, a cartel that's sort of dwindling and in peril right now and could fall apart. If it does fall apart and people just start turning on their taps, like Saudi Arabia and UAE, to sell as much oil as they can because they don't care about the price so much because they can sell it for a low price, whereas here in Canada, we're wanting pipelines, or the people with oil want pipelines, thinking that the world needs our oil more than ever. Well, no, it needs it less than ever. Just because the prices are temporarily high, that means nothing, and I think they probably know that. But OPEC's ability to quickly respond to supply shocks and influence prices is severely diminished now. And if prices, tanked to like $20 a barrel or something, it would not be good for the transition because everybody would buy a gas car. It would cost nothing to fill.
Yeah.
And, in developing nations, they would try and import it. And transition would continue, but it would be drastically slowed down. So does oil know that? And could they do anything about that? I don't know. But without a cartel, it's hard to do whatever you want. I mean, we talked about this before for years, that, it's going to take cooperation when oil prices start to, when they see the end is near, that it's going to take serious cooperation to keep those prices high. And by the way, our local utility here, because we were talking about keeping coal running until 2050 in our jurisdiction, in our 1.2 million person grid and province in Canada, there's a report that was leaked that says there's an extreme risk to do so, and this is going to make the average cost of electricity 95% higher by 2040, let alone by 2050. It seems a little bit crazy that they would see this. And maybe, renewables aren't perfect right now. We do get cold weather here. Batteries don't work as great. I heard a SAS Power employee with the utility employee say that those batteries that we have that we're testing, the lithium, well, they don't work more than 1,000 discharges, and so they're useless. And that's typically what a lithium-ion battery does, is about 1,000 discharges, and then it loses capacity. But there's stuff out there now that does, 15, 20 times that, and also works in cold weather. And, they're being made. They can't go out and buy one right now to start testing them, but they're being made. They're in the world. They're proven, and they need to be proven here. We need to get them in as soon as possible and prove them here and in other places here where it gets cold. For the New York Times, the cost of keeping Trump's coal plants open is pretty shocking. So Trump, the administration down there in the United States, has made coal plants stay open. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of talk about doing it for the workers. It seems to be about owning the libs, about, killing environmentalism, putting a stake in the heart of environmentalism. And that makes no sense because these actual companies are losing a lot of money by staying open that they wanted to close, right?
Yeah.
So the Trump administration ordered Asian coal plants to stay open under the emergency powers. Despite planned shutdowns, keeping these plants online has already cost hundreds of millions of dollars, with much of the expense expected to be passed on to electricity customers. So if you do save and prolong a few coal jobs for a few more years, people will be paying higher electricity price. Everyone, the people who have the jobs, the people who don't have the jobs, which is most people. So the orders are also contributing to rising U.S. mercury emissions after it was declining for years, right? So TransAlta's coal plant in Centralia, Washington, hasn't burned coal since December, but still requested $20 million for just 3 months of standby costs, which it now has to do. The costs include $4.6 million for coal and diesel already stockpiled, $7 million to dispose of unused coal in a landfill.
Okay.
$8 million in recurring costs every 90 days for wages, maintenance tools, chemicals, and insurance. And restarting the plant would require massive energy inputs, including 75,000 gallons of diesel and 3,200 megawatt hours of electricity per startup. So Washington state lawmakers imposed new taxes and emissions charges to discourage coal use, more than doubling the cost of generating electricity from the plant. So they shut down. Other coal plants may need over $100 million in upgrades if these emergency extensions continue, which is absurd. I'm sorry. It's just stupid.
Coal was one time the cheapest electricity, but you just can't ignore the costs of the pollution that it causes, for one thing. And also, solar, wind, and batteries get cheaper every day. So coal is no longer competitive in terms of absolute lowest cost. All right, so I have yet another topic I wasn't necessarily going to bring up again because we've talked about it a lot, and that is clean energy in remote communities. Now, this is a fun topic. It's one that I enjoy, but we've covered a lot. The reason I decided to bring it up again was it just included a detail that we haven't really talked about before. And so this is a remote community in northern Canada. And the community's been running on diesel for years and years. And we know this is a thing in many remote
way up in
communities.
the Arctic?
Yeah. So what did they do? They opened up a hydroelectric dam. Well, it's not a dam. It's called run-of-river hydroelectric. So there's essentially two kinds of hydroelectric power. And the one that we talk about the most on the show, the one that's the most common, the one that people know about, things like the Hoover Dam, where you build a gigantic dam and you create a reservoir, and then you can draw down the reservoir as you need it through turbines and create electricity. But a run-of-river hydroelectric doesn't need a dam. It just essentially harnesses the movement of the river as it continues to flow, and it attempts to not disrupt the river ecosystem as much as possible. But this is the first of its kind, at least in northern Canada. They tried to look for other examples of this because they wanted to have as much information as they could before they decided to build it. But they realized, no one else has done this before.
Well, wait a minute here. We had a listener a few years ago in BC who was working on a run of...
Well, yes, I guess
what I mean is...
going to
give me a tour of it. It fell through, but we were going to have a tour of a run-of-river. Now, I looked it up, and it seems like it's a bit different because the river was diverted a bit in BC, I think.
Yeah.
I'm maybe speaking above my knowledge here, but I thought part of it was diverted into a small, but there was pretty small hydropower situations with those, though.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I mean is it's the only one of its kind in a remote area.
Right.
So these have been around for...
This is like in the Arctic Ocean, isn't it? It's way up north.
Yes, way up north.
That means that transporting diesel would be very expensive. Diesel would be expensive to begin with, but to transport it all the way up there would be crazy.
Yes, and it's a common problem. Sometimes they rely on ice roads to do stuff like that and truck it in on, across ice when it's frozen in the winter, that sort of thing. But yeah, so they have in the past relied on millions of liters of imported diesel for their electricity, heating, and hot water. Their isolated geographic location made the idea of clean energy possibly seem not really feasible, but they came up with this plan. It's only 7.5 megawatts, so it's not super huge, but this is a small community.
Yeah.
And this one hydroelectric dam is now powering 80% of their community. The thing they couldn't so far convert over is the sort of larger buildings, institutional buildings, things like schools, because they have a heating system already, and they would have to essentially replace the heating systems in their larger, office buildings and stuff. So they have not done that yet. But all the residential is now all powered with this hydroelectric power. So about 80% now is clean energy, just 20% left to go that is still relying on the diesel. But just, think about how much less diesel you're going to have to transport up to that remote location.
And I would think that they would be in line for maybe some government grants to do some solar. Now, solar wouldn't work for almost half the year very well.
Yeah.
And not at all during 2 or 3 months of in the middle of winter. But that could offset some more, diesel use and probably be worthwhile, I would think. It would be cost effective.
Yes. And what they've done already has been funded in part by different grants that have been available, but they worked very hard to mitigate the environmental impacts of this because, like I say, no one had really done one of these in such a remote area. So there are still people that are concerned that it might disrupt the fish too much in the river. They did do studies starting in, I believe, 2019, where they studied the fish populations. And so some people are still kind of worried that maybe they didn't study that long enough, that there is possible still disruptions to the fish life in the river, but it's certainly less disruptive than a giant dam.
So the run-of-river situation in the west coast of Canada and British Columbia that our listener wrote us about said that they did have some fish protections involved.
Yeah.
I think it might have been a fish ladder or a fish diversion or something, some sort of technology. Yeah. But these things are never perfect, of course. It's never a perfect, environmentalists tend to hate hydro of any kind these days.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And, you got to be careful. But then the other nice bonus here is when they have excess electricity, they have a deal with Hydro-Quebec, so they can sell their power. So they're actually expecting to also make money off this, about $4 million a year in the first 7 years of operating this thing. So, they're
really.
Yeah,
Jesus.
Yeah.
That would be a lot of money for a small community up on the Arctic Ocean.
Now, it did cost $125 million to build this project, and, it was funded in part with grants from the government, but this seems like an absolute win-win for everybody. And it just sort of points to the fact that every place is going to have probably a slightly different solution.
I'm shocked that they would be attached to the Quebec power grid because they're so far north. Like, why would they even build the grid that far north?
Yeah.
I can't figure that one out. But anyway, if you'd like to contact us, and I hope you do, it's the Clean Energy Show. That's what you're listening to. Talk to us about anything. Drop us a line, criticize us, give us compliments, give us stories that you think we should be talking about. cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. You can also leave us a voicemail online at speakpipe.com/cleanenergyshow. And the Clean Energy Show, of course, is an independent podcast powered by listeners like you. After the show, we encourage you to check our Patreon link in your show notes and go and support our work. Doing so gets you perks. Patreon.com/cleanenergypod.
Okay, moving along. This story is from Apple Insider, and it's about the Department of Justice in the U.S., and they put in a request to Apple and Google for user data. These sort of things happen periodically, and, Apple in particular does not like giving out user data. They're pretty good about protecting people's privacy, so Apple and Google have not yet responded if they're going to release this user data. But what has happened, there's an app called EasyLink. Did you know about this app at all?
No.
Yeah, so it's an app you can get on your phone that can be used as a diagnostic tool for your car. So cars have a diagnostic port that you can...
I got to get this for my son.
Yeah.
Okay.
It might be good. And of course, like any diagnostic tool for a car, it has many very useful applications. You never know what's exactly wrong with your car. And you take it to the dealership typically, and they plug into the port and they can sort of tell
charge you $90 to do so.
And they charge you $90. So a lot of people try and do that on their own. And this app is one way.
Brian, I have been doing that, but I have not heard of this app before. I've used some of the more standard apps. I can't remember their names, but they're not that. And they just tell you the codes and you can reset the codes.
Yeah.
So it'll tell you what's wrong with the car. And believe me, any combustion car has problems in my life.
And that's all useful, of course, but you'll recall, Volkswagen got into severe trouble over tuning their cars to be able to detect when they were being emissions tested.
And then they'd play nice. They would
play nice when it was detecting that it was checking for emissions. And then when the car got out into the world, it would just go and spew more thing. They were using the software to tune the car. Anyway, this is one of the main uses that people have been getting this app, is that you can do that. You can tune your car in such a way that you might get more performance out of it, but it creates more pollution. So the Department of Justice is suing this company because this is a violation, they say, of the Clean Air Act.
The Department of Justice of the United States is doing a good thing?
Yeah, it's like, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. But bypassing emissions control is one of the reasons people get this app. So we don't know what's going to happen with that. But of course, we are against people making more pollution.
I hate that. I was experienced it just the other day again, and it was a sports car.
Oh, yeah.
And they probably tuned it. They probably tuned it for more, richer mixture of gasoline. And it's not acceptable anymore. And coming up next is... Why, it's the lightning round. It's time for the lightning round.
The lightning round is a fast-paced look at the latest headlines in climate, clean energy, and transportation.
A drone strike has hit a nuclear reactor in the UAE. There's no major damage, but Iran, I guess, was the perpetrator. And I don't know what they were thinking. I know they hate the UAE. Their state media somebody took out a machine gun and fired at a UAE flag the other day. So much you're missing out the news. But if they, most nuclear reactors are impervious to drones, but I don't know. Like, they might have weaknesses. Like, it just seems like if you go to war with somebody, or if somebody doesn't like you, another state doesn't like you, that seems like a vulnerability.
Look, James, everybody thought the Death Star was impervious.
Yeah, that is true, Brian. It is a very good point, and it was not.
It was not.
Zero-emission vehicles sales rise 75% in Canada, and experts have pointed to rising gas costs and new federal rebates. So, they took away the rebate for a couple of years, and sales tanked. They tanked.
No, and Europe as well. EV sales are up quite a bit in Europe as well, and it's the same reason they are also experiencing high gas prices.
So this is from PV Magazine. Spanish engineering company Intergia is testing floating PV systems, that's solar panels, adapted for manure lagoons at pig farms. I don't know how they adapt them. Perhaps they put an air freshener on them to reduce ammonia emissions while generating on-site solar electricity. So I guess if you have a pig farm and you have the thing about pig farms is lots of manure.
Sure.
Lots of manure. And you could turn that into something good and spread it on your crops, but you have to process it. And I guess there's lots of ammonia emissions from that. And I don't think people around pig farms tend to appreciate that. So they're covering them up with floating solar, which is a thing. That's a thing. And they put it on other things like canals. 2 prototypes are being assessed to measure emissions reduction, durability, and energy performance. I wouldn't want a used panel from that operation. No, thank you.
Well, it's probably a good way to keep the thieves away from your solar panels, as we talked about last week.
Yeah, nobody's going to steal. Hopefully nobody's going to steal those, although you never know. Chinese auto and battery giant BYD added 55 new flash charging stations between May 7th and May 14th in 1 week. These are these huge stations that require these giant batteries, which are the same batteries that go into the car. and they suck up power from the grid slowly and disperse it fast into the car because the grid connection may not be available, or it may cost a lot of money to have that sort of power available to charge these cars in 5 to 9 minutes. So that's bringing the nationwide total almost to 6,000 across 312 cities. And I'm sure by now it's over 6,000. So 312 cities in China. I know it's a big country. I know there's lots of people there, but that's a pretty darn good deployment for something that they barely are hitting the market with right now.
Yeah.
Like one of their more popular, bigger vehicles, because the Chinese population likes the bigger vehicles to transport multiple generations of their family. They've sold like 100,000 pre-orders so far, and they have to slow down production. That's what the new Blade 2 batteries that charge really fast. BYD's flash charging app has exceeded 1 million users so far, so people are waking up to this in China. The chairman of the company admitted battery supply is tight as sales take off of the new Blade 2 batteries that charge in as little as 5 minutes. Constraints will loosen because manufacturing is and will ramp up. Time for a CES Fast Fact. Roughly 1/3 of the world's lithium comes from salt flats in Argentina and Chile. 70% of cobalt, which is an important part of a battery's electrode in traditional lithium batteries, comes from the Dominican Republic of Congo. The Democratic Republic of Congo, where the expansion of mining operations has led to more cases of child labor and unsafe working practices. So the rise of sodium has benefits beyond the price and availability of that mineral. So that's a good thing. Pollution from coal-fired power plants that can block sunlight is significantly cutting solar output, according to a new study. Now, I've witnessed pollution from wildfires from last summer and other summers curtail my solar output on my roof. That's no fun. It's a feedback loop of climate change. It's really depressing. So aerosols reduced global solar generation by 5.8% in 2023. Which is equivalent to about 111 terawatt hours of electricity, which, if you don't know, is a lot.
Yeah.
The study's findings suggest that there's a risk of overestimating the climate benefits of solar if pollution from coal power is not controlled. And of course, coal is going down, except where tyrants try to keep it not from going down. But basically, coal is coming to an end. And when there is coal, that coal seems to be turned off in lieu of renewables when the renewables are going strong. For the first time, Ukraine has managed to hit the Moscow oil refinery. There's an oil refinery in Moscow. They've tried to hit it before. And it's the most protected facility in Russia.
Yeah.
And they hit it with multiple strikes. And I was watching a clip from Russian people watching it, and they're saying, "Oh, good, it got hit. The drone got hit. Boom, it's good." Oh no, in Russian when it got through. In April, 81.9% of new cars sold in Denmark were electric. 81.9. That's pretty good. That's second only to Norway. China's coal and gas power generation rose 3% year over year in March, marking the fourth straight month of increases in coal production as wind, solar, and nuclear output all underperformed. Wind conditions during March and April were unusually poor. Solar generation also lagged, and several nuclear plants faced extended refueling outages. So it was perfect storm of a lot of bad things.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect coal and gas power use to go up in China, but in this particular case, it did.
Hail outdoes hurricanes. The United States is the number one reason for solar insurance losses. So what can you do about it? Well, new solar farms are incorporating real-time weather forecasting, and they have trackers. That's the things that move the panels to follow the sun.
Yeah.
If they are capable to stowing the panels away at a more than a 60% degree incline, then the hail can't really damage them at that angle. So that's something that they can do here, but they have to know when the hail's coming. Most new farms are doing this, though. So yeah, when you try to invest in solar farms, you have to buy insurance, and the insurance is expensive. But if you come up with technological ways of preventing hail damage, this is particularly in the United States. But then hail is becoming a bigger thing now. Even in Calgary, Canada, hail is just obliterating the place.
Right. Well, we've talked about how insurance companies now have specific climate risk people on staff. So yeah, if you're building a solar farm somewhere and you start talking to your insurance broker and they point you to somebody who says, oh, you got to be careful about the hail in this area, or either mitigate it, or we're going to have to charge you high premiums for your insurance.
So another one of China's biggest EV makers is XPeng, and their CEO says he sees level 5 autonomous driving emerging by 2030. He used to be pretty cynical about the future of autonomous driving, but level 5 means it drives anywhere. It has human-like knowledge and can basically go anywhere. It's not restricted by... I don't even see level 5 as being necessary to the expansion of robotaxis.
Yeah.
Unless you want to go from city to city, which would be nice. I mean, that would be cool if you could do that.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of places here where there's no bus service, people in rural communities, if you get elderly and maybe you could have a service that would be economical to drive people around. Something I've always thought about, but
yeah. Level 4 is mostly what we're talking about when it comes to, autonomous taxis.
If level 4 is solved, then they can go to all the urban areas and cover most of the world's population. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's arguable, and maybe there's some restrictions that need to be put on that. Solar, wind, and batteries can provide 24-hour power at prices that are competitive with gas-fired power plants, says the Financial Times reporting on a study. R&E storage, that is renewables plus storage, can provide power for more than 95% of the time at competitive cost in countries that include China, India, and Brazil. So if you have just renewables and batteries, you can do 95% of the power required. That's not true for us where we live because we are seasonal. But these other countries, for most of those countries, it works very well. And there's nothing stopping it from going forward other than there is some challenges, because when you have a little bit of traditional power or fossil fuel power and renewables, the grid gets expensive until you replace them all, and then it becomes very cheap. But you have to, when you're running them in conjunction with each other, we're in difficult times right now with some places. In March 2026, renewables officially overtook natural gas as the largest source of electricity on the U.S. power grid for the first time ever, generating 35% of power compared to 34.4% of gas that it had of the grid. At the same time, Texas is racing ahead on energy storage, adding a massive 12.9 gigawatts of grid batteries. These are batteries, lithium batteries, that this year alone, more than half of the entire U.S. battery pipeline is going to Texas because it is a free and open electricity grid. And we see a little bit of that sort of market in Alberta, which had lots of renewables going onto it until the government said, we don't like renewables. It makes our gas people feel sad. And finally this week, Pakistan's government drowned in fossil fuel debt while citizens launched a solar revolution. As we know, talked about it several times on the show. This is one of our great stories here, positive stories. By early 2026, the country had imported 51 gigawatts of solar modules, creating a shadow grid that is larger than the official grid. And this is without anyone encouraging anyone to go buy a solar panel, but because the grid was so bad, and because cheap Chinese panels came into the market, everyone... You probably had a buddy who did a few of these installations and now is doing them all the time, unofficially. Yeah. And just doing these unofficial installs, and factories and businesses are using them because the power grid goes down and you have to have diesel to back up those places. And that's expensive, even more expensive right now. So Pakistan's shadow grid of solar panels and a few diesel generators out there and batteries, even batteries are used with diesel, produce more power than the actual official grid. And the savings for people, $12 billion so far, plus another $6.3 billion in avoided gas imports in 2026 alone. So solar share exploded from 2.9% of the power grid in Pakistan in 2020 to 32.3% last year. And still growing strong this year. Still going. They haven't slowed down. They've expanded even.
3% to 32% in just 5 years. That's amazing. All right, you can find the Clean Energy Show on social media like TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky as Clean Energy Pod, and our email again, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. And as always, please hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening to us, and you'll get New episodes every week.
So now's your chance to go join the Clean Energy Show Patreon at patreon.com/cleanenergypod. And as always, we give thanks to our generous Patreon Clean Club executive level members, Tiernan, Brent Routley, and Green Bastard. And thank you all for supporting the podcast. We'll be back in 7 days.
See you next week.